If you play e4 as white but do not want to deal with super complicated main lines of the Sicilian defense, I recommend that you go for the so-called Alapin Variation, which is much simpler and also quite tricky and aggressive. Your initial idea is to play d4 and to build up this beautiful pawn center. Another advantage of this variation is that in most cases your opponents are going to play knight to c6, which is standard for the Sicilian defense in general, but against the Alapin variation, this move is actually kind of wrong. You play d4 as you intended, building up this beautiful center, attacking this pawn, potentially your opponent is ready to go forward and chase away this knight, they'll usually trade. And now they still have to face this threat of your pawn marching forward and kicking off their knight. And that is why bringing up the knight right there was actually wrong to begin with. Nevertheless, at this point, they will have to find something. In most cases, they will play d5 themselves, and if not, indeed, you're going to push the pawn, chase away this knight, gain space advantage, and it's all good for you. If they play pawn d5 themselves, then it leads to a pretty tricky variation, and you need to go knight c3, surprising your opponent yet again. They were expecting you to trade, but instead you just add more pressure and force them to make a decision. This pawn on d5 is now attacked twice. Again, in the vast majority of the cases, they're going to choose the most obvious solution, capturing this pawn on e4. In a moment, I'll tell you what to do if they choose to defend this pawn, but in most cases, they will take right here, expecting you to recapture, but you come up with yet another surprise, pawn d5. Anyway, now this pawn is free to go, and you can gain the space advantage and a little bit of development advantage by kicking this knight. The next question is, where can the knight go? Well, it can go to the middle of the board because of your queen that controls this square. Moving the knight somewhere there is also wrong because after queen to a4, you come up with this double attack and the knight will be lost. Moving it back to the perfect starting position just feels too passive for black, therefore knight e5 is the move that most of your opponents will play. Now they expect you to finally recapture the pawn, but you do a trickier thing. You play queen a4 check first, and once they cover, you then recapture this pawn by the queen, while hitting this knight once again and gaining one more tempo for your development. What can they do now? The knight needs to go. Trying to defend it by f6 is just awkward. Now this knight is getting locked there, it can't get out, plus the king is exposed, it's just totally bad. Therefore, they probably need to move the knight away. And in this position, you certainly could just develop and use your space advantage to claim some very comfortable advantage. However, you can also choose this knight b5, a little trick, which I think is quite fine here for white. The idea is, quite often your opponents will play either knight f6, trying to gain a tempo hitting your queen, or will try to get rid of this annoying knight and go pawn to a6, but either way, they're gonna lose to spectacular smothered checkmate knight d6. But it's not just a cheap trick. Even if your opponent noticed the threat, it's still not at all easy for them to stop it, because what can they do? If they try to trade off this knight, it's actually another losing blunder, because now their king is in check, and the only piece that can cover it is the queen, but then you grab it and win the game. Another tempting idea by black is playing queen a5 check, as it looks like a double attack, but in reality, it's not. You just cover, countering this queen, and your knight on b5 is actually defended. Therefore, they cannot take it. They have to move their queen away, which means that this check was just a waste of time. Moreover, not only they need to control this square, they also need to guard this square, because from there, you're going to fork their king and rook. Therefore, they'll usually play queen b6, then you just keep attacking this queen. You want to push it away from these two squares, and after a couple more checks, the job is done. The queen will need to move, and once it moves, it ends up in the same fashion. This time, Vishanen is playing this variation as white, and his opponent played pawn e6. Instead of capturing right here, he decided to play e6 to guard the central pawn on d5. Then you just push your central pawn forward, gaining this space advantage, and you get something very similar to the French defense, advanced variation, but actually it's even a better version for white because you don't have this pawn on c3, which you typically have in the French. Therefore, you could develop your knight to a comfortable square, and your position is just great. Moreover, the main line, the most commonly played line here, is black trying to develop these kingside pieces. They bring the bishop out, then they bring the knight out, and after this they castle. They play everything that classical chess tutorials teach them to do, and they lose the game on the spot due to bishop takes h7, the Greek gift sacrifice. The king needs to move now. Knight to g5 checks the king, and if the king goes back to g8, then there is queen h5, queen h7, very standard attacking pattern, which wins the game for white. If the king moves forward, it needs to stay away from this diagonal, as you've got your bishop there. If the king tries to hide here, of course, it's still extremely vulnerable. You can push this pawn forward or play queen d3 check, and either way, it's going to be over pretty quickly. Pawn h5, king moves here, and Anand played knight to f7 with this double check, which also happens to be an attack of their queen, and after king moves and knight takes d8, his opponent resigns soon. Now, what if your opponent plays something different, not develops this knight to c6? Well, if they play something passive, such as pawn to d6, pawn to g6, and whatnot, it doesn't really matter. You're gonna just play pawn d4, build this strong pawn chain in the center, and then just develop comfortably, and basically you don't need to know anything special. You just have a little bit better position with the space advantage. This time we've got a game between two grandmasters, and black played knight to f6, the move that you rarely see on amateur level. It attacks the pawn, but the obvious drawback of this move is that white can push the pawn forward and attack this knight. Nevertheless, the knight stays in the center, and that is why it is okay for black. The position remains to be very tricky, however. White still played d4, and after the trade, black went d6, trying to open up this diagonal as well as undermine the center. White played bishop c4 to gain a tempo, attacking the knight, and it led to a really spectacular game. Black goes knight b6, countering the bishop. White goes bishop b5 check. So far it looks like absolutely nothing special, standard chess, but it changes right on the next move. After bishop d7, instead of taking or defending the bishop, all of a sudden white played pawn e6. Now, it looks super counterintuitive. Like, why would you do that? Now, here's why. The bishop cannot take it because it's pinned to the king. But how about just grabbing this undefended bishop on b5? Well, white's got the move queen to h5 with a very unusual double attack. Now this pawn on f7 is pinned to the king and attacked. Plus, from here, it also attacks this bishop on b5. And black certainly can go into this line, it's not all over, but it feels unpleasant. That is why, in the actual game, he just captured this pawn on e6. And white slided the bishop back to d3, creating yet another threat. For example, if black is careless and plays any generic move, such as knight to c6, can you see how white can finish the game? I'll give you a couple of seconds. It's queen h5 check. Black needs to cover, and now you can sack one of your pieces right here. Queen is more spectacular, so let's go this way, and it's a checkmate. Black noticed the threat and played g6 to control this square. White nevertheless pushed h4, aiming for h5. Still not easy for black to defend this position. He played knight c6, and white goes h5, attacking this pawn. Clearly, black cannot take it because of queen takes h5 with a checkmate. Black played rook g8 to defend it, and after the trade, white came up with a really brilliant move, rook to h8, sacrificing the rook, because if the rook moves, here comes bishop takes g6 checkmate. Black once again noticed the danger and played king to f7. White continued with queen check, the king moves, and yet another surprise, rook to h7. White came up with two brilliant and unexpected rook sacrifice in a row. This time black has nothing to do but to accept this rook sacrifice, but then queen to h5 wins the game and black resigned. This pawn is pinned down to the king. The h6 square is also controlled by white twice, by this bishop, sniper bishop from c1, therefore black can't cover. And if the king moves, there's just queen takes g6 followed by queen to h7 checkmate. What's amazing here is that black played all very logical and seemingly proper moves, but that was quite a devastation. Here's another high-level example between two grandmasters. Playing black is Vakhitov, who was the youth world champion, Asian champion, and once defeated Carlsen. The black attacks the pawn goes forward, and in this case, white decided to a little bit revert the moves. Instead of playing d4 right away, he first played knight f3, which doesn't seem to make a big difference. However, it turned out that he had some really cruel plan in mind. After d6, white gives this check bishop b5, and once black covers, white still goes back to bishop c4. Now, by the way, what's the point of this intermediate check and then going backwards? Well, this bishop on d7, which was provoked to be there, is now a little bit awkward. It also blocks out the queen, therefore the queen from the d8 square cannot somehow defend or affect the central squares. That is why bishop b5 check first and not bishop c4 straight away. Nevertheless, right now the knight is attacked, black goes back knight b6, definitely expecting the bishop to retreat, but all of a sudden the bishop got sacrificed on f7. And after king takes, there is pawn to e6, an absolute madness and a really, really interesting and clever sacrifice. What can black do now? Of course they can chicken out and just go back somewhere. But then white gets back their sacrificed piece and just enjoys very comfortable advantage, attacking this centralized king, which can no longer castle and is very weak and exposed. Therefore, it doesn't seem like a super appealing option. Just capturing this pawn by the king is kind of reckless. White can keep checking it, keep attacking. Therefore, bishop takes e6 seems like the most reasonable move. But now knight to g5 comes with a fork. And if black wants to hold on to this bishop, they have to make a bold move, king to f6, marching with his king forward. White can keep attacking with queen f3 check, still putting pressure, and if black tries to accept this sacrifice of the knight, that is actually a losing error. After h4, white basically wins the game within just a couple more moves. Queen f4 check, the king moves, and now white can play pawn h5 with a beautiful pawn checkmate. The other move that strong players tend to choose, besides knight to f6, is pawn to d5, challenging white's center right away, but the drawback of this is that after the trade, black needs to bring their queen out, and sometimes you can make use of that. Therefore, I wanted to share with you one brilliant example of that so that you see some new attacking patterns. Now, once queen captures, white played d4, black went g6, knight f3, bishop g7, so far so good, just more or less standard development. And now there is a move that you wish to play in such positions often. It's the move knight to a3. Usually a knight on the ring is dim, but in this case you have two specific reasons to bring in your knight to the edge of the board. One of them is knight b5. Extremely unpleasant, because from there your knight is going to be jumping to c7 with a triple fork to king, queen, and rook, and it's not that easy to stop it because you can always bring your bishop to f4 and add one more attacker to this square. Therefore, this attack develops gradually, but when your opponent realizes that there is a threat, very often there is no normal way for him to stop it. The second idea for keeping your knight there was actually used in the game. Black took here on d4, and instead of recapturing, white played bishop c4. And this bishop is supported by the knight. That's the second reason for having your knight right there, and you start gaining tempos hitting this exposed queen. Black, however, realized, hey, let me just deliver this check to the king, and once the king moves, I'm gonna grab this pawn and I'm up material. But white surprised him once again with the move bishop e3. It looks like, hey, wait a second, how about me just taking this bishop? But black can't do that. If they do capture the bishop, there is a beautiful sacrifice, bishop takes f7. Still exploiting this advanced position of the queen. And once the sacrifice is accepted, there is knight to g5, which counts with this fork, and white wins this exposed queen. Black figured it out and instead played knight h6, aiming to jump somewhere there. White recaptured, black castle, white did the same, knight f5, so far so good. But now after rook to e1, black once again faces the opposition to their queen, which feels uncomfortable. They decided to retreat the queen to c6, but after rook c1, they are facing a similar opposition yet again. This time they need to be really careful, as if black does nothing special, there is bishop takes f7 check, which would expose their queen on the next move. In light of that, they move the queen right here to d6, but white kept chasing it with knight to b5, hitting the queen once again, and once the queen went back to d8, thinking, oh, okay, finally I'm coming back to where I started, now it's gonna be safe, white played knight to c7. It attacks the rook, but if the knight is captured, there is still bishop takes f7 check, attacking this queen and winning the game. Apart from openings, if you wish to know the 2 simple actionable rules that will help you achieve 2000 rating one day, check out this video right there. And if you wish my help to improve your positional understanding in chess, check out the free masterclass by clicking the link up there.